This journey has been kind of a long road, and it's very easy to lose the thread. The seminar at the beginning, the first couple of lectures, he's talking about empty speech and full speech. In French, parole vide, parole pleine. Empty speech is when the patient fills the session hour talking about anything without saying much. Sometimes they update us about their week, or we chit chat. Basically, the idea is that they are speaking from the point of view of their egos and not involving their subjectivity. So you listen to the patient and it's like wondering, but they're not approaching their truth. And I think now we can start relating these first sessions when he was talking about empty speech with what he has been saying in the last sessions, that he's been talking about the ego and narcissism. And we can be a little bit more precise about this. So in empty speech, the subject is not speaking its truth because it is the ego that is speaking to the other. And the other, the analyst, is like an image in the mirror. So I think in that way we can start putting everything together. That's empty speech. Full speech is the opposite. It is speech in which you commit something of yourself, and also you are changed by the saying of this. We were calling this the performative aspect, as someone pointed out, not in this sense of performative as merely performative, but the fact that you do things with words. You perform a symbolic function through language. And once you say this truth about yourself, you come out of it other. You change. This is what can make you change in a psychoanalytic session. The fact that you were able to enunciate some truth about yourself. And similarly to this, Lacan distinguishes two planes. One plane that he calls in French is the communiqué, what is communicated. This would be the speech when one is like trading information, talking about something that is a factual statement, you are settling some matter of fact. And on the other hand, there is a plane of recognition. In recognition, speech is a symbolic act. It's not just transferring information, it's again performing a symbolic act. And the whole aim of the psychoanalytic process, Lacan is saying, is to carry the patient from empty speech to full speech. We go in the psychoanalytic process from, let's say, chatter about the ego to being able to say that signifier, that word that is important, and that also founds a recognition between the patient and the analyst. And we have to read this again to put all the pieces of this puzzle together with a fight. I don't want to get deep into the political aspect of this, but there was a huge political fight between the different schools of psychoanalysis for power and also for recognition, right? And the whole seminar one, in a way, is about this political fight that Lacan is having with other schools of psychoanalysis. So the dominant school in psychoanalysis at that time was precisely ego psychology. Authors like Hartmann, Chris, Lowenstein, and of course, Anna Freud. Lacan mentions all of them in the seminar. The idea of the ego psychology psychoanalysts was that the ego is the healthy part, the adaptive part of us, the mature part. The ego has functions of its own. It can grow, it can mature, it can also defend itself. The goal, the aim of analysis for the ego psychologist is to strengthen the patient's ego. And in this way, you're helping the patient's ego to adapt to reality. And this goes hand in hand also with the conception of sexuality. where at the end of the sexual development, you find a unified genital sexuality. And the model to achieve this, the model for the patient, is the analyst's ego. The analyst needs to have like a mature, strong ego himself, a well-adjusted ego, and the patient in a way is imitating the analyst ego, is copying the analyst ego, identifying with the analyst. So this is a little bit quick, cartoonish picture of the ego psychology, but you get the idea. And Lacan is opposing this. He's saying, no, no way. This is actually getting Freud backwards. The ego is not the subject. The ego is not our ally. We have been talking about the optical device and the mirror and narcissism. So now we can say the ego is an imaginary construction, like this reflection in the mirror. And we can think also about the example with the fish that is tricked by an image. Well, the ego of the analyst is also an image that can trick us. The ego is, Lacan says, the seat of misrecognition. So if you're reinforcing the ego in the analytic process, you're actually reinforcing the thing that blocks the truth. For Lacan, analysis does not work with the ego. It works against the ego. It works towards the subject that's speaking, let's say, underneath the ego. So there is a different understanding of the ego, a different understanding of the analytic process, and a different understanding of analytic technique, which is the core of this seminar. A different understanding of resistance and transference. For ego psychology, resistance is the enemy. The patient is like digging in and resisting the analyst. But Lacan is reframing this. Resistance is not some kind of stubbornness. For Lacan, resistance is structural. When does resistance show? When the analysand, the patient, is free associating and approaching some truth, and he's about to say it, to put it into words, to get to this moment of full speech and recognition. He's getting close to this traumatic core of his subjectivity. At that moment, Lacan says, resistance will show up. And it shows up in the context of transference, in the relationship to the analyst. So resistance and transference, we were seeing this, are interrelated. Transference, for Lacan, has two sides of the coin. We can say the imaginary side and the symbolic side. Very similar to what we were saying about communication and recognition, or about empty speech, full speech. Imaginary side, symbolic side. So the imaginary side is when the analyst becomes the mirror. What the ego psychology was proposing as the good model, identify with the analyst, with the healthy part of the analyst, the healthy image. Lacan says, no, it's a dyad. It's two. So if it's an ego-to-ego relationship, a relationship of two, the analyst will become a friend, a competitor, a rival. Right? You will be captured by this imaginary transference. But transference, Lacan says, it's not only imaginary, it's not only an image. There's also symbolic transference. And the symbolic means that there is some kind of pact or contract between the two subjects. So like there is a third element organizing the relationship. So Lacan's point is that you don't get past resistance by making the ego stronger. You work through the transference by listening to the subject, by interpreting, by making full speech possible. We're trying to connect these things, full speech, empty speech, the imaginary, the optical experiment, transference, resistance. We also should mention the two cases of the children that we also worked on. It's not by chance that Lacan is choosing these cases. There is Melanie Klein's, you remember, Little Dick, this boy, 4 years old, almost no language, indifferent to everyone, barely playing, shows no anxiety. We were saying perhaps today we would say he's an autistic child. And we saw that Melanie Klein does something brutal. She takes, you remember, the two trains, a big one, a little one, tells the kid, the big train is daddy, the little train is Dick. Then he runs the train to the train station and says the train station is mommy. It's like dramatizing the Oedipal symbolism, right, in front of this child with no regard for where the child is. But it's a way of operating that creates an effect. Something like switches on. And the child, after this, starts symbolizing the world around him. Something changes. There is a door that opens there, if we believe Melanie Klein. And then we have a very different technique with the case of Robert. The analyst is another woman, Rosine Lefort. This is the wolf child. And this is also like a devastated orphanage child that, again, no language. It looks like he lives entirely in the real. He only says two words, Madame, the wolf, the loup. And this is a very different technique, very patient, step by step, very available to the child. But again, it's about allowing the child to name himself as the wolf and to be able to build like a symbolic thread that is connecting this child back into a relationship to the other and naming himself, having some kind of imaginary consistency, seeing himself reflected in the mirror. So my point is that the two cases point in the same direction, that what makes us human is the symbolic order, not instinct, not adaptation, not a strong ego, but the symbol. Even if it's like forced from the outside, like in the case of Dick. The human infant is born too early, very premature, with no coordination of his body, completely dependent on the adult. And Lacan says the child finds its first unity, not inside himself, but outside, in this reflection in the mirror, in the shape of another body. And he emphasizes the moment that the child recognizes himself or herself in the mirror. The mirror itself is a metaphor for the other, another self that reflects back onto us. We see ourselves in the other. And the point is, the ego is built from the outside in, on an image of the other, an image of in the mirror, on the imaginary level. That's the ego. Lacan at one point tells his students, he's telling us basically, go and read Freud's introduction to narcissism, on narcissism and introduction. One thing that we took from this text is this difference between the two narcissisms. One has to do with the unification of the body, and this is how the ego is first created. But then throughout our life, we continue to develop our narcissism by identifying with the other. And also when Lacan reads Freud's essay on narcissism, he distinguishes between the ideal ego and the ego ideal. Ideal Ich und Ich ideal. Perhaps Freud was using these two terms interchangeably, not making a clear distinction between them, but Lacan says we can make a distinction. The ideal ego is this fantastic, wonderful image of what we are or what we would like to be. It's an imaginary element of our mind. We would like to be like this. Beautiful, rich, smart, desirable for other people. And then he distinguishes this image from the ego ideal, which he connects with the symbolic aspect. The symbolic aspect is that we also have an ideal, but this ideal has to do with the norms and the rules and the values that we have incorporated from our parents, our family, society. And this is the voice that is observing us and comparing us and saying, you didn't act correctly in this situation, or you are not smart enough. So we are judging ourselves all the time. It will still be like almost 10 years later that Freud will propose the concept of the superego. But this is like the first way this ego ideal is a first formulation in that direction. We were saying that the imaginary is tricky. Lacan uses all these examples with animals. We get tricked by the image. And the example is when you fall in love. When you fall in love, you're trapped by the imaginary, by fascination, dependence, also rivalry. But then he also talks about transference love. And he says pretty much the same happens in the consulting room. We call this imaginary capture. We call it transference love. We were also relating that to narcissism, right? Now, let me put, I think it's the final piece in the puzzle, and then we can start again trying to connect all together. Lacan says that love is a form of suicide. Now we have more elements to understand why Lacan is saying that love is a form of suicide. So let's start with the master and the slave. You remember that Hegel was proposing these dynamics in which when you're in a state of nature, you face another individual and you want to submit the other, you want to dominate the other, and you engage in this fight to death. And the master is the one who is not afraid to die. So in the master-slave fight, the master is the one who risked everything and didn't flinch. So that willingness to die is the whole source of his power. And in this sense, the master is identified with death. The master is the one who is able to die. He prefers to die before giving in. Now, what happens when you fall in love? Lacan is suggesting that the image you fall in love with is a master image, an image of the master. Someone is fascinating, beautiful, complete. When you love, you're captured by this ideal. It is like the flawless version of the other, or the flawless version of yourself, but reflected back in the other. Because I possess this person, or if I can possess this person, I can participate in this perfection. And also, something complete, in a sense, is death. Anything that is alive is unfinished, moving, wanting, missing something. This is even in Plato already. So, because it's identified with the master, and because it's complete, the image you're chasing in love is a kind of like death mask, the perfect image in the mirror, the perfect image when you fall in love, the master image at bottom, this is death. So I read it from Lacan. Lacan says, the image of the master, which is what he sees in the form of the specular image, becomes confused in him with the image of death. So we should read love is a kind of suicide with this image, this perfect image that we see in the mirror or in the other as a mirror. And this is an image that lacks nothing, is a perfect image, is also an image of the master. It's an image of domination, and it's an image where subjectivity is cancelled. And in this sense, it's the image of death. We are captivated by the image to some extent, the way an animal is captured by an image. And also this makes things a little bit more complicated, but this also has to do with something that is different in humans and in animals. And that in humans, the fit between instinct and reality that animals have is broken. This is why Lacan is talking all the time about, and again, he seems to be mixing topics, but when he talks about the prematurity of birth, has to do with this. We're not like this. If you see these documentaries about animals, sometimes some species, the parents are not even there when the breed is born, right? For many animals, they don't need to be taken care of. They are born and they can provide for themselves. In mammals, most of the time, or in birds, most of the time, yes, the parents are there, but you will still see even something that is evolutionarily relatively close to humans, like a horse, few hours after being born, is standing, is moving. The human infant is helpless, uncoordinated for a very long time. The nervous system isn't even complete at birth. And the point for Lacan is that we are participating of the symbolic world of language and the imaginary world also of being recognized. We are entangled in this world of desire before we have complete mastery on ourselves. How do we close this gap, this inadequacy between our bodily maturation and our desire to be complete? By narcissism, by the image in the mirror, by identifying with the other. When we fall in love, we want to merge with that image. We want to merge with them. But that image is also an image of completeness. And we were saying it is also an image of death. Let me summarize it like this. I will really want to stop being my own messy, living, separate self and melt into a perfect frozen ideal. But this also, again, means that this idealized other I'm merging with is my master and my death. And that's why love is a form of suicide. You stop being you. You stop owning yourself. You want to hand yourself over to that perfect image. So there is the imaginary capture that happens in the dyad, in the analysis, in the dyad, in psychotherapy, I would say, and in analysis, there is this imaginary capture, and transference love has to do with this. It's narcissistic love in this sense. And the way out of this is the third term, which is the symbolic. The law, language, even a name. We can again think about Dick or the wolf child. This moment when two becomes three, then the fight to death becomes a relation, right? So you are boyfriend and girlfriend, or mother and child, or father and son, or siblings, or partners. This is the same symbolic order that was forced into Dick, and it was rebuilt for Robert. It's like the symbol that lifts the subject out of the imaginary deadlock. And this again has to do with what Lacan is taking from Hegel. There is this German word, Anerkennung, which translates as recognition. We can go beyond the imaginary through a symbolic order in which we can find mutual recognition. And desire can be played out at this level too. We have the struggle to the death, where the image of the master is the image of death. The master can be the person we fall in love to. We fall for our master. Love is a kind of suicide because it has this narcissistic element. And I think it's very interesting that there are very different versions of the Narcissus myth. In all of them, he dies. Sometimes it's because he starves, because he's so fascinated with his own image, he stops looking for food. Sometimes it's that he falls into the water. There was another version in which someone kills him, but in all the versions, he dies. So narcissism being captured in this imaginary phenomena makes it impossible to be alive, to connect with your desire, with your subjectivity. This misrecognition kills you. The last text that Lacan was commenting in the seminar was called a meta-psychological supplement to the theory of dreams. Is something that Freud published in 1917. So this was 70 years after he published his famous book on the interpretation of dreams, the Traumdeutung. It's a short article in which he is explaining a little bit more about the mechanics of dreams, how dreams are formed, above all. And he starts with this beautiful paragraph that I shared with you in the group a couple of weeks ago, that he says that when we go to sleep, we undress our bodies, we remove our glasses, he says our false teeth, right? But in sleep, we also undress the mind because we withdraw all our interest from the world. The sleeper pulls all this investment back into himself or herself and restores a kind of narcissism. And Freud says this is why dreams tend to be very egoistic, and the dreamer is always the star. The protagonist of the dream is the dreamer. At the same time, Freud says this withdrawal of the libido, this going back to a narcissistic state, is never complete. There is a leftover. He calls this a day residue. So there are some ideas, some thoughts that we had, something that we saw that still has a little bit of a catectic charge, some energy, sometimes it's something very minor, something that we heard during the day, a comment, but this little memory, precisely because it's very indifferent, very minor, it can connect with a repressed unconscious wish that kind of attracts this memory. And this becomes the seed of the dream. So Freud says, think like a telescope or a microscope that has this tube. And so inside this tube that we usually are when we are awake, more closer to this end of the tube, where is our consciousness, in the dream there is a regression. We regress. The dream wish, instead of going forward, like making us conscious and act or reason about it, it goes backward. And in this model of the mind, when you go backward, what you find is the unconscious. In the unconscious, when you go back all the way in this psychic apparatus, there are ideas or thoughts that are expressed as pictures. You see that in dreams, sometimes we have abstract thoughts, but most of the time, dreams are very visual. And this even starts, if you notice, sometimes when you're falling asleep and you are thinking about something, you're thinking, I don't know, I don't click with that person. And then you have the image of a mouse clicking or something, or you're already translating these thoughts into images. Or you are thinking, oh, he's faster than me, how he solves things. And you are already imagining a race. Or so Freud says, word representations are converted into think representations. So words are converted into things or images. Now, Freud says the same thing happens in psychosis. In schizophrenia, the words themselves are treated as things. And I think I gave this example of someone who had a schizophrenia. Now, she was reading The Lord of the Rings, and she had to stop reading because the symbols became too real for her. So it's this idea that the words, the symbols, are mixed with reality. So Freud says, in the same way that a psychotic has hallucinations, a dream is also a hallucination, because when we are dreaming, we believe in this. This becomes the real thing for us. So Freud makes comparisons between these, psychosis, dreaming, but he also makes distinctions. But the idea is that what is on this end of the psychic apparatus, what is developed in us as adults, reality testing, consciousness, this is switched off to some extent for different reasons, in sleep, in dreams, and I would say not developed enough in children. And there is a discussion that's something that Freud comments in passing, and Lacan stops at this in the seminar. Freud says casually, that sometimes people, when they are awake, they don't know that they are sick, but they have dreams that already seem to announce that they have some kind of organic problem. So you don't know that you have, I don't know, the flu or a tumor or whatever. You don't know it when you're awake, but during sleep, the dreams are telling you about this. And Lacan says, well, this has to do with the optical machine, because in waking life, what I'm seeing, I'm not seeing myself directly. I'm always reflecting myself in others. And when I'm so focused on my ego, how my ego looks, or identifying with the other, competing with the other, loving the other, I'm not seeing myself. So he uses there a French word, méconnaissance, that translates as misrecognition, failure to recognize. And I'm going to read, this is the sentence that Lacan says. Lacan says that the ego is a capacity to fail to recognize, that's the méconnaissance. The ego is a capacity to fail to recognize is the very foundation of the technique of analysis. In this sentence, you have everything. You have the ego, narcissism, the fight against ego psychology. Ego psychology, we were saying today, wants to make the ego the ally of the analyst and the healthy part of the person. And Lacan is saying, no, the ego is narcissistic and fails to recognize. And my whole technique of analysis is based on this. I'm not interested in the ego. The ego is the enemy in a way. I'm interested in subjectivity, which is different. Subjectivity has to do with the subject's real history, desire, libido, unconscious, not with the way he wants to present herself or himself, not with the ego. So this is very radical. The ego is not an organ of self-knowledge. It's, I would say, the opposite. It's an organ of self-blindness. We have the dyad. We have these two terms locked in the mirror, me and the other, in the fight to the death. And we were saying that what breaks the spell is a third thing that can be a word or a name. And Lacan says that when a child is named, before he can do anything, before he can even speak, he's surrounded by this world of words. Let me read it from him, so maybe it's clearer. He says, that a name, however confused it may be, designates a specific person is exactly what makes up the transition to the human state. This is recognition, this is the symbolic. We're humans because we can transition into this symbolic world. I read it again. That a name, however confused it may be, because the symbolic doesn't have to be in perfect order. We arrive at a family that has its own history, its own trauma, conflicts, whatever, but there has to be something named. So that a name, however confused it may be, designates a specific person is exactly what makes up the transition to the human state. If one has to define the moment at which man becomes human, we can say that is the moment when, however little it be, he enters into the symbolic relation. So this is the term from the imaginary to the symbolic. Two animals in a mirror fight stay stuck, or in a couple conflict, right? Sometimes couples get entangled in these fights for who's right, who's wrong, who is making more money, who has the truth, who made a huge mistake. But the moment something is named, the moment there is a symbol, you have the possibility of moving beyond the dyad. So again, the mirror as the imaginary and the name as the symbolic. And Lacan says the symbol introduces a third party, an element of mediation which brings the two actors into each other's presence, leads them onto another plane, and changes them. And there is the poet Mallarmé that talks about language as an effaced coin passed from hand to hand in silence. So what he's saying is, even if we're talking about words that are worn because we use them many times. They don't mean much. Right? We're chit-chatting, but just the fact that we're speaking, the pure function of language is pointing at the fact that we all share a symbolic world. So language is this effaced coin passed from hand to hand in silence. And Lacan there makes a comment. He says, and choosing to stay silent at the right moment can be the most cunning speech of all. He's talking about the analyst. When is he more intelligent, smart, astute, cunning? When he shuts up. Not when he wants to teach the client. The moment he decides, I will remain in silence because the most important thing is to hear what the analyst and what the patient is saying here. And he also talks about this example of Mr. Keller, who got a letter from the New York publisher. And this is a minor example, but it is about how once there is a contract between the author and the publisher, all this kind of fight and competition and mirror-like relationship goes to the background because now it is organized. What are your duties? What are your obligations? What are your rights? So language or the law as a third that organizes this dyad. And at the end, he talks about the title of this lecture, which is, I'm going to read it in German, I'm sorry. Zeitliche Entwicklungsgeschichte. Zeitliche Entwicklungsgeschichte. So we have Geschichte is history, Entwicklungs is development, and zeitlich means temporal. And this is an expression that Freud uses to talk about development and regression. And Lacan is saying Freud sometimes wants to talk about some kind of temporal maturation, temporal development. But what I'm interested most is the Geschichte part, the history of the subject. So again, not the maturation of the ego, not the expected development according to pre-established milestones that a subject or a person is supposed to achieve. The history, I'm reading it again from Lacan. He says, not the Entwicklung, the development, but the Geschichte. That is, that within which the subject recognizes himself correlatively in the past and in the future. He ends the lecture saying that analysis is not about the past, it's about the future. This goes against like a stereotype of the analyst. Oh no, don't do psychoanalysis because, the past is the past, it's gone. What sense does it make to again talk about your childhood or what happened 20 years ago or 40 years ago? But he says that analytic technique works because it happens in the right order. This is literal from the lecture. It happens in the right order, from the future to the past. That reminds me of something that Borges, the Argentine writer, said once, that he said, you cannot change the future. The future is, already determined, but we can change the past. So he was playing with this, right? But this is the idea that the past is not like a fixed dustbin of facts. It's something that can be rewritten. How do you rewrite the past? By projecting yourself into the future, by desiring, by being a subject, by wanting things to happen in your life. So the patient has a future. His history or her history are still open. And for that, to work on that, he needs to rewrite the past. This does not mean that we have like a total freedom to reorganize our history. We are born in a very powerful symbolic world that cannot be changed at pleasure. And so Lacan says human beings share in the universe of symbols. They are included in it and submit to it much more than they constitute it. They are much more its supports than its agents. So we're not agents that can change the symbolic world or our experience, but we can work on parts of this. We can reorganize, process, re-elaborate with the idea of understanding where we come from being able to articulate our desire, being brave enough to engage in full speech.